There are games you finish, and then there are games that stay stuck in your head for years, the kind where you randomly remember a scene, a soundtrack, or a moment and think, yeah, I need to experience that again. And honestly, in 2026, replaying some of these hits different, not just for nostalgia, but because they still feel better than most new releases. So if you've been wondering what's actually worth going back to, trust me, this list is going to hit. So today, we're talking about 15 single-player games that are so good, you're not just going to remember them, you're going to want to replay them all over again. Some of these are emotional, some are pure fun, and a few might surprise you. Let's get into it. Starting with Red Dead Redemption 2. And yeah, I already know this one's obvious, but there's a reason for that. This game doesn't just feel like a game, it feels like you're living inside a world that doesn't care about you, and that's what makes it special. The first time you play it, you're focused on the story, Arthur, the gang, everything falling apart slowly. But when you replay it, you start noticing the little things, the random encounters, the conversations you missed, the quiet moments where nothing is happening, but it still feels alive. Riding through the world with that music in the background just hits differently the second time, and somehow, even when you know how the story ends, it still lands just as hard, maybe even harder. That's the kind of experience you don't just play once and move on from. Moving into The Witcher. 3. Wild Hunt. This is one of those rare games where replaying it almost feels like playing a completely different story. The first time, you're probably rushing through the main quests, trying to figure out what happens to Ciri, making choices without fully realizing how deep they go. But when you come back to it later, you slow down. And that's when the magic really hits. Suddenly, side quests don't feel like side content anymore. They feel like full stories on their own, sometimes even better than the main plot. The world feels darker, more detailed, and way more alive than you remembered, and the choices start to feel heavier because now you actually understand the consequences. Even something simple like riding through Velen or Novigrad with that soundtrack in the background just pulls you in again. And the crazy part is, you can make completely different decisions and end up with a totally new experience. It's not just replayable, it's one of those games that almost demands a second run just so you can see everything you missed the first time. Then you've got God of War, and this is where replay value hits on a completely different level. The first time you play it, you're focused on the journey, Kratos and Atreus, the tension between them, that slow build of a father trying to figure things out. But when you come back to it, knowing where their relationship ends up, every small moment feels heavier. Even simple conversations while traveling start to mean more, like you're picking up on emotions you didn't fully notice before. And gameplay-wise, it just feels so smooth that jumping back into combat is instantly satisfying. The Leviathan axe still feels incredible to throw and recall, and once you understand the mechanics better, fights become way more fun and strategic instead of just intense. What really makes it worth replaying, though, is how personal it feels. It's not just about gods and monsters, it's about growth, regret, and connection. And somehow, the second time through, it all hits even harder. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of those games that doesn't really leave you after you finish it. The first time you play it, it's intense, emotional, and honestly kind of exhausting in a good way. You're constantly reacting to what's happening, trying to process every twist as it comes. But when you replay it, something changes. You're no longer just reacting, you're observing. You start noticing the small facial expressions, the silence between conversations, the way characters carry guilt or anger without even saying it, and that's where it hits differently. What makes it so replayable is how much context changes your perspective. Scenes you once saw as simple now feel layered, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes heartbreaking. Even the gameplay tension feels sharper the second time because you already know what everything leads to. It's not a game you enjoy in a traditional way every time, but it's definitely one you respect more with each replay. And weirdly enough, going back to it makes you understand the story more than the first time ever could. Cyberpunk 2077 is one of those games that feels completely different depending on when you play it and how deep you go into it. The first time, you're probably just trying to take in everything at once. Night City, the chaos, the story, and Johnny Silverhand constantly showing up in your head. It's overwhelming in a good way, like there's always something happening no matter where you look. But when you replay it, things slow down a bit, and you start appreciating the atmosphere more than the noise. What really makes it worth coming back to is the choice system and different life paths. You can build V in so many ways that your second playthrough can feel like a completely different character, with different decisions, different relationships, and even different outcomes in key moments. Night City also hits harder once you already understand its world, because you're not just exploring anymore, you're reading between the lines of everything going on. And with how much the game has improved over time, going back now actually feels smoother, more polished, and way more immersive than it did at launch. It's one of those games where replaying it isn't just fun, it actually feels like unlocking a version you missed the first time. Ghost of Tsushima is one of those games that feels almost like stepping into a movie, but in a way where you're actually in control of the pacing. The first time you play it, you're probably focused on Jin's journey, the Mongol invasion, and that constant conflict between honor and survival. But when you replay it, the world starts to breathe differently. You're not rushing the story anymore, you're just existing in it. What really makes it worth coming back to is how smooth everything feels once you already know the mechanics. Combat turns into this clean, almost rhythmic flow where every stance, every parry, every strike feels intentional. And the world itself, it's insane how much detail you start noticing the second time around. The wind guiding you, the quiet villages, the golden fields, it all hits way harder when you're not distracted by the main story. Even side activities feel more meaningful because you understand Jin's transformation better, from samurai to something more unpredictable. It's peaceful and intense at the same time, and that balance is what makes it such a strong replay experience. Elden Ring is one of those games that honestly feels bigger every time you think about it, let alone replay it. The first run is usually pure chaos in the best way. You're lost, you're getting destroyed, you're discovering things in places you didn't even think mattered, and somehow it all still pulls you forward. But when you go back to it, that's when it really starts to feel different. On a second playthrough, you're not just surviving anymore, you're experimenting. Builds completely change how the game feels, and suddenly bosses you struggled with before start turning into moments you actually look forward to. The world also opens up in a new way because you already know where things are hidden, so instead of confusion, it becomes exploration with purpose. And that's where Elden Ring shines the most, because it rewards knowledge without ever making it feel boring. Even the same areas feel fresh when you approach them differently, and you start realizing how much you missed the first time without even noticing. It's not just replayable, it almost feels designed to make every run feel like a new journey. Horizon Forbidden West is one of those games that really shows its strength the second time you go through it. The first playthrough is usually all about taking in the world, the machines, and Aloy's journey as everything keeps expanding in scale. There's always something happening on screen, and it can feel like you're just trying to keep up with how massive everything is. But when you replay it, you start to slow down and actually appreciate the design behind it all. On a second run, the combat feels way more satisfying because you already understand how each machine behaves, so fights become more tactical instead of stressful. You start setting traps better, aiming for weak points more confidently, and actually enjoying encounters instead of just surviving them, and the world itself hits differently too. The landscapes, ruins, and tribes feel more connected once you already know the bigger story behind everything. Even side missions feel more meaningful because you're not distracted by the main mystery anymore. It's one of those games where replaying it doesn't feel like repeating content. It feels like you're finally playing it properly.
Taking the shot!
Sekiro. Shadows. Die Twice is one of those games that feels almost impossible the first time you play it. You're getting punished, learning timing the hard way, and probably dying more times than you'd like to admit. But something strange happens once it finally clicks. It stops feeling unfair and starts feeling like a rhythm game where you're completely in control. When you replay Sekiro, it turns into a totally different experience. Boss fights that once felt overwhelming suddenly become clean, almost like a dance. Parrying, dodging, and countering all start flowing naturally because your muscle memory kicks in. And that's where the replay value really shines, because the game doesn't rely on story twists or big choices. It relies on how good you've actually become. Even regular enemies feel different because you're no longer scared of them, you're just reading them. What makes it even better on a second run is how fast everything becomes once you know what you're doing. Areas that used to take hours now feel smooth and controlled, and you start appreciating the level design in a whole new way. Sekiro doesn't just let you replay it, it basically dares you to come back and prove you've actually learned it. Uncharted 4. A Thief's End is one of those games that feels like a blockbuster movie you somehow get to play through, and the first time you experience it, you're just locked in from start to finish. The pacing, the set pieces, the chemistry between characters, everything pulls you forward like you're watching something huge unfold in real time. But when you replay it, it stops being about surprise and starts being about appreciation. On a second playthrough, you start noticing how carefully everything is put together. The small jokes during quiet moments, the subtle expressions during conversations, even the way transitions between gameplay and cutscenes feel completely seamless. Combat also feels better once you already know what's coming, because you're not panicking anymore, you're actually enjoying the flow of it. And those big action sequences, they hit differently because now you're not focused on what happens next, you're just enjoying how well they're designed. What really makes Uncharted 4 worth replaying is the emotional weight. You already know where Nathan Drake's story is heading, so every moment feels a bit more meaningful the second time around. It's not just an adventure anymore, it's the end of one, and that makes going back to it feel surprisingly personal. Marvel's Spider-Man is one of those games that just feels good from the moment you swing out of that first building. The first playthrough is usually all about the excitement of movement, learning how to chain swings, and getting lost in the freedom of New York. Everything feels fast, colorful, and honestly a bit overwhelming in the best way. But when you replay it, that feeling changes into something way smoother and more satisfying. On a second run, swinging becomes second nature. You're no longer thinking about how to move, you're just flowing through the city like it's muscle memory. That's when the game really opens up, because you start paying attention to details you missed before, like small interactions in the city, side characters, and how alive everything actually feels. Combat also becomes way more fun, because you already understand the mechanics, so instead of surviving fights, you're styling through them. What makes it even better to replay is the story pacing. You already know the big moments, so you're not rushing through to see what happens next. Instead, you're just enjoying Peter's journey, the relationships, and the emotional weight behind everything. It turns from an exciting superhero game into something more personal, and that's what makes going back to it worth it. Skyrim is one of those games that doesn't even need an introduction at this point, but somehow it still feels different every time you come back to it. The first playthrough is usually chaos in the best way possible. You start as a prisoner, pick a direction, and suddenly you're doing quests you never planned, joining factions you didn't even know existed, and getting distracted every 5 minutes by something random on the road. It's messy, but that's exactly what makes it memorable. When you replay Skyrim, everything slows down in a good way. You're no longer lost, you're experimenting. Different builds completely change how the game feels, whether you go full stealth archer, heavy warrior, or pure mage chaos. Even the same towns and dungeons start feeling new, because you approach them with a plan instead of confusion. And the world itself has this weird comfort to it, like you already know its rhythm, so you can just relax and explore without pressure. What really makes Skyrim worth replaying is how much freedom it still gives you. You can ignore the main story completely and still end up with a full, unforgettable experience. It's not about finishing the game, it's about living inside it differently each time you return. And that's why even years later, people still go back, install it again, and somehow lose hundreds of hours without even realizing it. Mass Effect Legendary Edition is one of those rare trilogies where replaying it doesn't just feel normal, it actually feels like you're rewriting your own story. The first time you go through it, you're mostly focused on the bigger picture, saving the galaxy, learning the lore, getting used to the choices, and trying not to mess things up too badly. But when you come back to it, everything starts to hit differently. On a replay, it's all about the decisions. The way a small dialogue choice in the first game can completely change how something plays out in the third game is honestly wild. You start paying more attention to your squad, your relationships, and even the consequences you didn't think mattered before. And that's where the Legendary Edition really shines, because you're not just playing 3 games, you're watching one continuous story evolve based on how you act. What makes it even better the second time around is how connected everything feels. Characters you barely noticed before suddenly become important, and moments you rushed through earlier end up being the ones you remember most. It turns into less of a game replay and more of a personal sci-fi saga where your choices actually matter from start to finish. Assassin's Creed Origins is a great way to wrap this list because it's one of those games that feels like a full journey every single time you play it. The first run is usually all about Bayek, his story, and slowly getting pulled into the world of ancient Egypt. At the start, everything feels massive, like the map is almost too big to take in, and you're just moving from one discovery to another without really stopping. But on a replay, the experience becomes much more relaxed and enjoyable. You already know the world, so instead of rushing through objectives, you start appreciating the details. Riding through deserts, exploring pyramids, or just walking through cities feels more immersive because you're not constantly chasing the next story beat. Combat also feels better once you understand the systems, so fights become more about timing and control instead of confusion. What really makes Origins worth coming back to is the atmosphere. Ancient Egypt feels alive in a way that's hard to explain until you slow down and actually take it in. The music, the environment, the way the world reacts around you, it all hits differently when you're not focused on finishing the game. It turns from a big open-world adventure into something you can just exist in, and that's what makes replaying it so rewarding. Batman. Arkham Knight is one of those games that feels like pure power the moment you step back into Gotham. The first playthrough is usually all about the story, the mystery around the Arkham Knight, and getting used to how intense everything feels when the stakes keep rising. But when you replay it, the experience shifts in a really satisfying way. Once you already know the story, you stop rushing and start appreciating the details. The combat becomes smoother, almost rhythmic, because you're not learning anymore, you're executing. Every counter, every glide, every takedown feels more controlled, and the Batmobile, which people either loved or got tired of the first time, actually feels more fun on a replay when you understand how to use it properly instead of forcing it through frustration. What really makes Arkham Knight worth coming back to is Gotham itself. The city feels darker and more alive when you're not focused on the plot twists, just patrolling, stopping random crimes, and soaking in the atmosphere. It turns from a story-driven experience into something closer to becoming Batman, and that shift is what makes a second run feel so different. And that brings us to the end of this list. Now I'm curious, which of these games have you actually replayed, and which one do you keep going back to no matter what new games come out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to see what your personal favorites are.